Hello. Thank you so much for joining. Hi. Thank you so much to those who are joining. We're going to give it about 2 minutes and then we'll get started. I'm seeing more people join. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to give it about 1 more minute and then we'll get started. Wonderful. We can get started. Thank you so much to everyone who's joining and trickling in. I'm Victoria Montero. I'm Chief of Staff at Common Future. Our team works to build a fairer economy and stronger democracy by investing in and uplifting models from communities that have historically been shut out of economic opportunities. Thank you again for joining this session. This is a part of our Redefining Risk series, where we unpack themes of risk and power in our economy and democracy. As we gather here today, on the eve of one of our most consequential elections, these themes could not be more relevant. Tomorrow, millions of Americans will vote on issues that directly impact their economic security and community well-being. And this timing really offers us a powerful moment to examine what risk means in our institutions. So before we kick this off, I want to start by just sharing a few examples that motivate our work and help us to think about this conversation. The first is the way that communities of color, particularly Black and Indigenous communities, have been financially excluded and shut out of access to loans. Banks may often label individuals and entrepreneurs as high risk because of things like their zip code, despite having a strong business plan and experience. Meanwhile, those same banks that deny loans invest millions in projects that put entire communities at risk, from polluting industries to predatory housing developments. This pattern, where communities are labeled as risky while being subjected to actual risks, plays out across our entire economy. Considering a bigger example, our food system, that offers one of the most stark examples of how risk and power operate in America today. A handful of corporations like Cargill have built monopolies that control everything from the crops in our field to the meat on our tables. These companies have pushed out smaller local producers who once formed the backbone of rural communities. But even more troubling, these same corporations effectively run investment banks that use their insider knowledge about crop shortages to bet against their own agricultural products. In effect, they're profiting from climate change and food insecurity, the very risks that they contribute to. While communities face rising food prices and family farms disappear, these companies post record earnings. This is what we mean when we talk about how risk is redistributed in our economy. The profits are privatized, but the risks are pushed onto communities. This dynamic really underlies many of the choices that voters will face tomorrow. It's present in decisions about environmental regulations, banking oversight, agricultural policy, and housing reform. And so when we talk about building a multiracial democracy, we're really talking about redistributing not just political power, but also the power to decide who bears risks and who's protected from it. Today, we're going to challenge this broken approach to risk. We'll explore how impact investors, philanthropists, and community leaders can make better decisions by redefining what risk really means. We'll examine how the current system's definition of risk has been shaped by the same forces that have concentrated power in our democracy. And we'll work together to envision new approaches that align with democratic values, approaches that protect and lift up all of our communities rather than just a privileged few. And so with that, I'm excited to turn to our incredible panelists to hear you all introduce yourselves. I'd love to hear more about your background and what really drew you to this conversation about risk and return. And so with that, I will kick off to Crystal.
Thanks, Victoria. Thank you for the invite to join today and for that beautiful introduction. You have my head spinning around the connection between political rights and social rights on the eve of the election tomorrow. But hi, folks. My name is Crystal Okafor, pronouns she, her, hers, and I am the director of the Division of Just Communities in the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development. We are Maryland's official state housing finance agency. That's a term that I'll probably use a few times during the chat, HFAs. Each state has one, and we are empowered to extend low-cost mortgage credit to moderate income households so they can become homeowners, but also to multifamily developers so they can build subsidized housing for low-income people. My initiative, Just Communities, is distinct in that it was founded just about a year ago as DHCD's Racial Equity and Social Justice Hub. Secretary Jake Day, who runs my agency, wanted a Just Communities initiative that would plan, implement, and evaluate strategies to lift up populations that have experienced socioeconomic marginalization. Secretary Day called this work righting the wrongs of the past. And those wrongs of the past are some of the things that Victoria elevated during her intro. So the history of how bankers, builders, brokers, and bureaucrats instituted segregation and discrimination through their decisions, many of which were investment related. In terms of why I wanted to be a part of this conversation today, it's because the people of Maryland live in separate and unequal neighborhoods, and assessments of risk were one of the primary drivers of these divisions across Maryland. For instance, in Baltimore, the city was redlined in 1937 when the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation published its residential security map. It designated East and West Baltimore as too hazardous for mortgage credit. So it really excluded those neighborhoods from what became the United States' primary levers of wealth creation during the New Deal era. To this day, East and West Baltimore bear the brunt of disinvestment and displacement. Baltimore's redlining map that the federal government published now coincides with what we call Baltimore's black butterfly, a term from a locally loved academic, Dr. Lawrence Brown. The black butterfly are those segregated areas in our city. They look like a butterfly's wings on our map. Segregated areas that are still longing for their due. So our black butterfly is the same as the red line areas on the 1937 map. The city of Baltimore still reels from a financial system that deemed race and risk synonymous. So that's where we have to really reimagine our assessments of risk. I think it's important for us to envision what capital stacks might look like and concomitant public and private systems might look like that can make repair for the past wrongs that people in Baltimore's black butterfly and comparable areas across the country have experienced. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I'll turn to you next, Kuru.
Thanks so much, Victoria. Hi, everyone. My name is Kuru. Pronouns are she and her. I am calling in from Detroit, Michigan, the Anishinaabe territory, unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people. It's so good to be here with you all. I am the Director for Capital Strategies at Justice Funders. For those of you that do not know who Justice Funders is, Justice Funders is a national organization, and all of our work is really centered around reimagining what philanthropy is and what it could be. and its practices. So we have programs that support individual, organizational, and field-wide transformation within the field of philanthropy to really achieve a just transition. We serve as a partner and a guide for philanthropy and reimagining its practices that advance a thriving and just world. We truly do lead with the belief that a just world cannot be achieved if institutional philanthropy continues to be constrained by its long ingrained practices that uphold the accumulation of wealth and power, while also perpetuating systemic and social economic inequality. We are guided by the just transition principles. For those of you that are familiar with those principles, really about building political and economic power to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative one. And majority of my work, so I'm the director for capital strategies. The majority of my work is focused on supporting movement organizations as they undergo and launch capital raises, capital campaigns for their community controlled funds, land and real estate projects, community land trusts, cooperatives, and so on. I've been with Justice Funders for about a year now. And so what really drew me to this conversation is not only the work that I do at Justice Funders, but my background in the field of philanthropy. I'm coming out of working and leading an impact investment fund at the local level here in Michigan. And throughout that time, I learned a lot about how traditional philanthropy defines things like risk and return. And I had the opportunity to really see that on a deeper level through the work that I was doing, and had the opportunity to really challenge what those definitions are, what they could be, and really begin to shift my own understanding of what it actually means to support communities as, you know, in that role as within a wealthy institution. And so I've seen what ideas of risk and return can do to harm community investments as well as support them. And so I'm super excited about the conversation that we'll have today and to share in this space with these amazing panelists.
Thanks so much, Kuru.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jamie Glochet, Director of Impact. Can you hear me okay?
You're breaking up a little bit, but it seems to be okay now.
Okay, sorry about that. Hi, everybody. My name is Jamie Glochet, Managing Director of Impact Investments here at Common Future. Spent a lot of my role in CDFI building out lending programs with communities that have been not invested in, as well as built in numbers, and now get to work with community and developing their lending programs here at Common Future and invest in emerging fund and fund managers. So for me, what drew me to this conversation was really around the paradigm shift that's needed. I felt like in all of my career in finance, I've always run into challenges, barriers, and paradigms or mindsets that continue to challenge and put barriers into mobilizing and moving capital. But I've also seen the orientation around risk and mitigating risk from an institutional standpoint then be imposed on the communities we're trying to serve, while as the prioritization of return from an institutional standpoint prioritizes the organization, right, and not the community. So that was really what has personally and professionally drawn me in. Coming from an Indigenous community that's often seen as risky, and a lot of lack of access to capital and opportunity within our communities because of systems that have been imposed on us. So this is why I'm here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. There is so much richness already that I'm so excited to dive into. And just to give some context for this conversation, we'll be exploring this notion in two parts. First, by unpacking what these notions of risk and return mean in our current paradigm. And then in the next part of the conversation, really visioning what it would look like to center this around community. So for the audience, as any questions come up for you, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll have a section at the end to consider that Q&A as well. So I'm excited to dive in. Kuru, I'm going to point this to you first. So if we want to redefine risk, we know that we need to start by unpacking what this means and the impact of the current framing of risk and return on communities. So I'd love to hear your perspective on what these terms mean and how we might start to approach them differently.
Yes, thanks, Victoria, for the question. Yeah, this is something that I have spent a lot of time thinking about just in the work that I'm doing right now with justice funders, but in my previous work as well. Because I do believe in the power of narratives, and oftentimes the words that we use will impact how we operationalize and how we move. And so oftentimes when we think about just words in general, we don't often think an immediate need to like demystify the words, right? But I do think it's important for this conversation around risk and return to really like demystify the roots of the words that we're using, right? So the concept of risk and return, like where did that come from? When we know that it was born out of a very traditional system within the finance world, particularly the banking world, which we know was deeply connected to a dark history of colonization and oppression. So when we use these words, we kind of have to ask, like, who are we accountable to when we're using them, right? What do these terms actually mean? Particularly in the funding and philanthropic world, right? When funders say risk, are they typically referring to the future and current risks at hand when we don't invest in communities, or are they solely referring to their own legacies and portfolios? And I think we all know the answer to that question. So we have to make it clear when we talk about these frameworks, right? Like what we mean when we use these words. But we use the word return as another example. Like oftentimes we're not thinking to ask the question of like, where are the returns coming from and who stands to pay for the costs of the returns? As well as, what is driving the belief that communities that have been heavily disinvested in because of stolen land, stolen wealth, stolen labor, are being done favors, right? There's an underlying belief that there's a favor being done when they're invested in by wealth holders, by institutions, by individual donors even. And so when we adopt those terms from the finance sector and we use them in the work that we're doing right now within movement spaces and in supporting communities, we kind of have to be careful about that. So things like return, we're really talking about a price that communities are paying for a belief in them, right? And this is by folks who have historically had wealth and power. And so when we get to a point of understanding what these terms are actually saying and how, and dissecting them fully, I think we can behave and think a little bit differently about how we approach our work, right? And so that's just kind of how I lead in these, when we're having conversations, particularly when we're adopting terminology that comes from a sector that we are trying to challenge and that we are trying to, kind of flip on its head, as how we are really thinking about the words that we are now using in our own work. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kuru. It really stood out to me when you said that there's two ways to think about risk, either the risk of what it looks like when we don't invest in communities, or is it really the risk to portfolios? And I think that that really starts to get at the heart of what this conversation is about. So I really appreciate that framing. Jamie, I'd love to hear your perspectives on this as well, especially as we think about ways that in our economy, existing power holders are able to benefit from the risks that they impose on communities while simultaneously calling them risky. That really leads me to question who benefits from this risk and return paradigm, and what are the costs that are imposed on those who are deemed risky?
Oh, thank you. Thanks for this question. When I think of risk and return from putting my financial CDFI lender institution hat on, I think of it in like the terms that we hear it in finance, right? Like borrower risk, credit risk, reputational risk, financial risk, market risk, regulatory risk, all of those notions of risk. And then when I think of return, I think of like, what's the return on investment? Like what's the fixed return, or like what's the interest return, and I think now the conversation is like, okay, well, what's the actual community return? And that's where I'm really curious about like how we can reimagine these notions. I think in history, especially when I think about my own community, Indigenous communities, these stereotypes that have been imposed on us, especially from the founding of the quote unquote founding of this country and the Declaration of Independence. There was some harmful language that was built into the Declaration of Independence that was used to essentially stereotype Indigenous people, to even kind of, dehumanize us and who we are as people. And I think for your question of who benefits from that, I think the wealth holders and the folks that are extracting wealth and power are the ones that benefit from it. My community here in New Mexico, we have it was found that over 60% of predatory lenders exist around tribal lands, so specifically preying on Indigenous people. And those entities benefited by creating 300% interest returns. So that's just another output of what's happening here when we're deeming communities risky by not supporting communities to have access to capital. I think it just continues to play into those harmful narratives and stereotypes and continue to decrease access to capital for communities that have actually quite already invested in this economic landscape. And I think when I think about return, I always share just out when I'm speaking that the cost of US land today is valued at 23 trillion, in my opinion. Like that's what's actually owed. That's what should be returned to Indigenous communities if we're going to talk dollars and cents around what has been stolen and extracted. So pushing folks to think about, okay, like what's the financial return to the communities we aim to serve? What's the economic return? What's the return we're giving in a reparative and restorative way so that all communities are seen? And when I think about it, like my own community, then the Indigenous community in place where I come from, if Indigenous people steward 80% of the world's biodiversity globally, why would we want to put these communities in position of risk when they're stewarding 80% of our biodiversity and we're interdependent on them to ensure that like we have a future where we can all thrive? So these are some of the questions that come up to me both on a financial, intermediary, institution level, but then on a human level, and then like on a systems global level of how we can look at risk and return in a very different way. Because ultimately what I've also seen is from some of the lending programs I've created and the folks that I've supported, oftentimes these communities are at risk from the economic and political systems that are outside of their control and not so much are risky as people.
Yeah, that's really powerful to really start to account for the risks that are imposed on these communities and how they exist within the system. And yet, all of the ways that we are deeply connected and reliant on these communities at the same time. I think the examples that you're providing in terms of the environmental stewardship and how all of our futures are deeply intertwined, and yet that's not accounted for in so many meaningful ways. So that really points to especially the second part of this conversation. So I'm excited to come back to a lot of these themes. So thank you so much for that, Jamie. And Crystal, I'd love to hear your perspective. I think that you started to raise some of these points earlier, but how do we assess risk and why? How do we mitigate risk? And what are some of the important principles for reframing that?
Yeah, happy to take this on and share some additional thoughts. From the government perspective, the housing finance perspective, I immediately think of underwriting, the processes we use to assess a borrower's ability to repay a loan. So, for instance, my agency has a program called the Maryland Mortgage Program. So it's providing soft seconds, low cost mortgage loans to low and moderate income households. An underwriter there might think about a house's appraised value. They might think about the buyer's credit score when underwriting. But like most state housing finance agencies, we implement the low-income housing tax credit. So that's the public-private partnership that states across the country use to build subsidized multifamily housing for low-income people. And an underwriter in that program might think about things like debt-to-income ratio, loan-to-value ratio, all when they're evaluating nonprofit developers to see if they are credit worthy in, to use the prevailing term. Why do our underwriting criteria, our typical processes of credit review need to be reframed? I think on the single family side, as I mentioned earlier, these processes are laden with systemic racism. In Maryland, in our formerly redline areas, there's an appraisal gap. So property values are so depressed in areas, in neighborhoods that were starved of capital in those formerly redline areas, that there is a gap between a home's construction cost and the final appraised value of the home. So developers, even nonprofit developers or community land trusts, are neighborhood led groups. They have little incentive to rebuild their own neighborhoods. My agency recently created a program called Uplift, utilizing progressive lending instruments for transformation to close that appraisal gap and to jumpstart housing markets in areas that have been starved of capital. But in addition to that appraisal gap created by redlining, there is the appraisal bias, which is also a consequence of systemic racism, but distinct from the appraisal gap. So appraisal bias is well documented in Black neighborhoods across the country, including in Maryland. Researchers at Brookings, Andre Perry's shop, found that housing is undervalued by $48,000 on average due to appraisal bias. So we necessarily need to think about new frameworks, processes, standards for underwriting if the ones that we're using currently are colored by noxious ideologies. I think on the multifamily side, restorative justice compels us to reimagine our assessments of risk. I have the privilege of getting to meet residents from across Maryland who are living in areas that have experienced socioeconomic marginalization, that have borne the brunt of our bitter history of racism. And when I speak to people in our so-called inner city that is still addressing the white and capital flight of the latter half of the 20th century, but also when I speak to people in Maryland's historically Black towns in rural and suburban areas, towns founded by freedmen to achieve self-determination for Black folks, these towns that have never received their fair share of state resources, I hear them sort of issuing a common call for collective land stewardship. Folks are thinking about community land trusts and cooperatives. Folks are thinking about how might we come together to own and develop land to meet our needs as we define them ourselves. We have advocates and community leaders becoming developers. And of course, these nascent groups don't have the development track record that even a CDFI would, that would encourage you in a CDFI to take on the risk of lending to them. Before joining state government, I worked for Share Baltimore, which is Baltimore's community land trust network. And we struggled to do business with the city, with Baltimore CDFIs, our local CDFIs, because we were still new organizations that had yet to establish the development track record that CDFIs in our city would trust. I think then, in light of what I said about single family, multifamily, systemic racism, restorative justice, mitigating risk could look like pivoting from an understanding of credit worthiness to one of credit readiness. As lenders, we should be building the capacity of our borrowers in each transaction. We should be using credit enhancement in canny ways that can increase our risk tolerance. We should be incorporating alternative data into credit review so that we're removing racial bias and introducing new components that can increase access to capital for home buyers, developers of color, other folks who have been excluded from our predatory financial system.
Yeah, thank you so much, Crystal, especially for making that so concrete in terms of what it would really look like to move to a different system and account for risk differently. And I would love, just before we move on to this next section, to dive in a little bit more to pieces that I've heard from all of you. I think, Crystal, you raised this idea of appraisal bias and the true value that is lost by not fully accounting for or having bias in the accounting process. Jamie, you raised this idea about environmental stewardship for communities and what's lost by not really accounting for that. I'm curious, What are the risks of not investing in these communities? This question that you raised, Kuru. I'd love to hear from any and all of you on that.
I think first and foremost, by not investing in these communities, we lose a huge opportunity to innovate the system of economy generally, because we're having a diverse like expertise and skill sets and backgrounds. And I always talk about how, yeah, indigenous knowledge and wisdom about living in relational harmony with the earth and all people is like so valuable to ensure that everybody is cared for and everybody thrives. So when I think on like a higher global level, again, there's a huge risk of not being able to tap into that wisdom that many of our like ancestors have known. And I think we run the risk of just, doing business as usual and continuing to keep the status quo as it is, as we're seeing huge racial wealth gaps continue to grow, huge inequities and inequalities, and what we're seeing on a global scale around like wars and poverty, disease, and climate change and climate shift. We lose that opportunity to really care for one another and show up in our highest human, I guess, beings. And of course, these communities continue to be put at additional risk, especially with, you think about environmental racism and a lot of how communities were planned and built. It just continues to exacerbate what's already happening. And we saw that in COVID, right? We saw that of how these inequities just really were quite glaring and how we needed to respond. And I think we miss an opportunity to be able to at least bring that wisdom and knowledge forward, but I'll let others go.
That's great. Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I was kind of thinking along those same lines. I think particularly thinking around, I talked about philanthropy earlier. With the first question, I think philanthropy stands to lose a lot, right? Like the term philanthropy itself means for the love of humanity. And so I think there's a loss of credibility if we're not shifting how we're thinking about investments into community. And yeah, I think that's a huge loss on the end on the part of philanthropy, and something for us to really to challenge and to push in the work that we're doing to help them understand that there is a huge loss that's at hand.
And I'll just add briefly that I think we are at a magic moment in our movements, in particular our movements for community control of land and housing. There are groups across the country who have been beating the drum for rent control, for social housing, for community land trusts, for land banks that are accountable to residents, for community benefits agreements, for community-led planning. And I think if CDFIs, philanthropy, government agencies like my own do not create an infrastructure that can fund these new tenures and tactics that Black and Brown communities say that they want, we stand to lose a lot of ground and cede a lot of ground to folks who do not share our interests. And in particular, I currently live in Baltimore, and our governor, Wes Moore, is Maryland's first Black governor. There's a progressive energy and attention that has been directed towards Baltimore. Finally, advocates. Working for the Community Land Trust in Baltimore, my board chair is a now 72-year-old woman, Janice Jones Dorsey, who the day that I first met her and I was interviewing for the job, she told me that she'd been a community organizer since 1968 in Maryland. And folks like her are reinvigorated by the attention on the city and the ability for us to finally raise philanthropic, but also public capital to address vacancy and housing injustice in Baltimore. It feels like a once in a generation moment. But as Janie stated, it will be business as usual if we do not reconfigure, retool, reimagine our systems to channel capital to folks who really have their ear to the soil. I think the movements for community controlled land and housing and shared ownership of real estate are really acting in a manner that is comparable to the initial founders of the community development movement. These were people who were informed by civil rights, informed by Black Power and other ethnic movements, and they wanted to build our neighborhoods for us, by us. And the community controlled land and housing, the sort of new housing justice activism, has that same spirit and ethos. But if we don't build, if we who are funders and lenders don't build tools, that capital products that can really finance this ecosystem, it'll be more business as usual. We won't pivot from transactional to transformational in the way that we need to.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think especially in this last piece that you raised, Crystal, hearing these ideas that haven't changed, like our community, our land, for us, by us, that hasn't changed. And that's really energizing in some ways, but then to look at how capital products haven't changed either, in the way that we haven't changed our approaches to communities. And so that's why we are in this position that we're in right now, where, as you say, like we have a chance to lose ground. We can't cede ground. We need things to really change in order to fund models in a different way, and to have the community and the land built for us and by us. So that's really powerful. And with that, I would love to take us into this next section as we think about what it really means to redefine risk and return in a way that centers community. So my question for you all is, as you think about redefining risk and a liberatory future where communities are centered, I'd love to hear, what does that look like for you?
I have some thoughts I could share on this one. So I'm really inspired by my colleagues at Bay Area LISC. They speak of redefining risk in service of mission. And I think that's such a powerful statement, and one that can inform our field. I first met the women at Bay Area LISC at a convening that the Center for Community Investment hosted on shared ownership of real estate this February. My friend and colleague Gretchen Biesing invited me and some of the other community land trust folks out to participate in this conversation. And that's where I first learned of Bay Area LISC's work on redefining risk and service of mission. They had a $500 million affordable housing family of loan funds that they stood up. They used philanthropic dollars as credit enhancement to increase risk tolerance. And in doing so, they were able to fund some of those groups that we've been chatting about on the call. They were able to provide loans to borrowers who were either led by POC or serving POC communities, standing up out of the box projects without ecosystems of support behind them. And they were able to originate good debt. So lower costs, flexible terms, large loan amounts to BIPOC-led orgs, including community land trusts, including orgs that didn't have a track record of development. And from the outset, this family of loan funds was had a public-facing data dashboard. One of their primary metrics was percentage of borrowers of color. So they designed their underwriting guidelines around that, around what they knew they would measure. And in community development, the work that Bay Area LISC is doing is important because we know that nonprofit developers led by people of color tend to fare worse on many of the financial health metrics that are important for underwriting, things like revenues, expenses, net income, total real estate assets. And it's not because our executive directors are unqualified, it's because folks are working in the hardest hit communities by organizations that typically aren't tethered to like a national organization that is like consolidating funding and redistributing it across the country. Like they're not leading the NHS, they're leading the small neighborhood-led group. So we need to be in a position to channel capital to redesign our underwriting criteria and our loan funds to deliver capital to the orgs that need it most. And I think that's a more transactional example, but one transformational example I'll offer is around the work that I'm doing in just communities. I just wrote a report called Separate and Unequal Neighborhoods, the baseline report for our Just Communities initiative. And one of the examples I lift up is that of Levitt and Sons. They developed Levittown in New York and a few other Levitt towns. They're like in the 20th century, they were the standard bearer for suburban tract home development. In Maryland, they built part of Bowie, Maryland, which is in Prince George's County, prominent, prosperous suburb, large Black population. But when Levitt and Sons built their Beller at Bowie development, they refused to sell to Black folks. So this was essentially a sundown town, a town where Black folks were excluded by custom. And now the Levitt family continues to benefit from the wealth they generated in building all these Levitt towns across the country. And they themselves have a family foundation that they use to issue millions of dollars of grants, typically for like cultural funding. If the foundation of Radical Possibility, they have urged organizations like Levitt and other funders to make repair for past wrongs, especially those past wrongs that are tethered to their coffers. So when you have developers like the Levitt family continuing to benefit from the wealth they generated by excluding Black folks, transformation might look like them channeling some of that capital to these organizations that are doing development in a new way that is the antithesis of what Levitt themselves did in the 20th century.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that, Crystal. Yeah, in terms of what it looks like, I think we're seeing, I think we're in a peak moment right now where we're seeing community control become a part of the conversation when it comes to how resources are allocated to communities, how, how capital is, can be shifted to really support communities and community reinvestment. I think it looks like 100% movement designed, movement controlled, and movement governed. I think we don't talk a lot about the governance too of these resources. It looks like that being controlled by the communities that have been heavily disinvested in, have been starved of capital, and I think that's a really part of reimagining that is really, putting a call to funders to really take some notes from what movement organizations are doing right now, right? They're really shifting, doing a 180 approach on what it means to invest in communities, particularly Black and Brown communities nationally. We're seeing funds, community-controlled funds, integrated capital funds that are really geared towards really challenging the status quo. And I think the more of those that we can see, I think the more control that communities can have over the capital that is, coming into their communities, what that looks like, the types of projects that are even, supported and funded. I think to your point, Crystal, the organization, the funder who, started a foundation and then is doing nothing about, what it is that they basically where their wealth came from and, to begin with. So I think once we start having more foundations, taking notes from what movement organizations are doing right now in this moment, I think we'll see some of this reimagination of what it means to be a capital allocator, capital holder, wealth holder could look like. And I think stewarding that capital through the lens of reparations or rematriation, really thinking about, terms like non-extractive finance, like what does that mean for communities? What does that look like? And, what is the harm in, a 3%, investment into a movement organization? Like, I think once we start really shifting, to think about reparations and rematriation, non-extractive finance, I think the power dynamic between investors and community has to take a significant shift in terms of how the approach, the practices, the narratives, even, I think obviously I think about words a lot. So I think often how we talk about investors and investees, and it's like those terms in and of themselves create an interesting power dynamic within, for communities that are, either seeking capital or are, raising capital. Yeah, and I think that there's a way that we could really shift and move, move us along a different path particularly within philanthropic institutions, by challenging those inequitable investment models, as well as the power dynamics that I mentioned between wealth holders and communities. So I think we're seeing more and more examples of this coming into the field. They are, really unique in that, particularly, I think the governance piece of this is one thing I think we really, want to see more of that being put in the hands of the communities as, the resources, the capital is supposed to support. So I think the more we see that, I think we could really reimagine what it looks like to have a liberatory future, where communities are in control of the resources. And maybe even foundations don't exist, right? Like the communities control those resources. Yeah, I think that's my vision, right? Where a world where philanthropy doesn't need to exist, right? And those, a lot of the time, particularly with family foundations, small foundations, a lot of that wealth is accumulated wealth and it's stolen wealth. And so I think that's what it looks like for me, for those, for us to really reimagine a world where we actually don't need the control of this capital to be in the hands of institutions versus communities.
Thank you, Kuru. Thank you, Crystal. Sorry, my internet was going in and out there, so I'm back. I imagine a liberatory future where communities are not only like reclaiming, but standing in their power with all agency and access to be able to build a future where not only their own communities thrive, but where everyone thrives again. I'm just trying to reiterate, right? Like if we can do this for those most unseen, unheard, marginalized, harmed, we can do this for all. Can you hear me okay? I'm sorry. Okay, great. And I just want to share a couple of examples of how I've seen this iterate over time in the past several years of my career in finance. One, the Buen Vivir Fund, they had an Aportas model, which was really amazing because they essentially said that investors or wealth holders should actually shoulder the financial risk and not put the interest rate on the communities to shoulder that, right? If they're really looking at transforming finance. So they showed that like it's possible. Wealth holders can shoulder the financial risk without expecting to put that on communities with an interest rate. And I know the CDFI revenue generation model is definitely all about that, right? Calibrating interest rates to be able to ensure the portfolio. And if you're doing microfinance, you want to make sure you have like the larger dollars as well to support. So I know that's in those models, but I think it allows us to kind of think deeper of like, okay, well, what about these models is broken in which we're trying to put the financial risk again to the communities that have been excluded from finance quite intentionally for the past 500 plus years. There's another model with Nusenda Co-op Capital that I got to participate in where essentially philanthropy shouldered 70% of a $1 million capital stack. Nusenda took on 20% as a CDFI credit union and foundation. And then the community organizations that wanted to pilot agreed to take on 10%. That was a $1 million fully collateralized demonstration project that has now grown into a $4 million project where now the borrower profile is 98% return. It was explicitly and intentionally designed for Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities. And the cost of, not the cost of capital, but the capital as far as the lending opportunity goes up to $50,000 now. And they've institutionalized it at a CDFI credit union level. It's not a huge money-making generation thing, but what's been neat is their orientation as institution around like return and even with risk. Yeah, I'll put that on there, Suzanne. Even with like return and the risk, one, they showed that our communities are in fact not risky. We just need an access point to access capital. And that an institution should actually carry that risk and burden, especially if they built their assets under management. And the last thing I want to say about the Co-op Capital Project, which has been really insightful, is you can see where the mindsets are shifting within the organization to where there's like overall commitment. Yeah, sorry. There was another point I wanted to share about that project, but it's really neat to see that this mobilization is happening within the CDFI field, which actually controls 454 billion in assets throughout the United States. Just learned that at OFN last week. But then within the Common Future side, we do a lot of demonstration projects, right? So we fund early fund managers, early funds, community land trusts. We funded revenue-based financing, entrepreneurial serving organizations. And I think what we've learned is you have to have like a holistic view of people to support them and understand that defaults are going to happen. That was a thing. Nusenda said, our actual measure of like impact is when defaults happen, we know we're actually reaching those most vulnerable because defaults are going to happen. It's just the nature of finance. It's going to happen. So where do we build in our risk mitigation, not from the institutional standpoint, but first from a community standpoint to ensure that communities are not at risk. So they have wraparound support services, financial education, economic safety nets in case life or the economy or the environment happens, but that actually the risk mitigation that we provide for them or we support that happens for them actually provides risk mitigation for organizations and institutions to be able to do these projects because really like our communities deserve a space to like be able to dream, to design and to do and problem solve for ourselves. And that orientation with philanthropy is shifted and not much of a savior orientation, but really working and standing together in support and solidarity with communities to lead the way forward.
Thank you so much for those examples. And especially what you said at the end, Jamie from Nusenda, really, really resonated with me. When defaults happen, that means that we're reaching the right people. I think that that represents like such a fundamental shift in the way that we think about capital, we think about lending, and more fundamentally about these power dynamics, which I think all of you have alluded to a bit. I would love to just hear examples from all of you of when you've seen those power dynamics actually flip, what that would look like if you haven't seen it yet. I'd love to just hear you expand on that.
I'll share just something that I saw recently with Black Farmer Fund that I find really interesting on the impact investment side is the way they've structured their notes when calling for investment. They actually prioritize their community first and foremost for return at the higher return. Whereas philanthropy and other investors come in later on the return and at a lower rate of return. But I think that shift and them being able to like state that from the onset of raising capital or raising further fund is really a demonstration of power and agency of saying like, this is the kind of capital we want. These are our terms of how you're going to invest with us. And we are actually going to prioritize our community first and foremost. I was like, heck yeah, that's amazing. And I'd love to see more of our community be able to do that. And just really just trust the good work that they're doing because they're doing full wraparound support for their community. But because the Northeast is such a hard place to want to acquire land because it's so incredibly expensive. And with climate change and the work that Black Farmer is doing, they're actually creating viable food systems for the future that benefit all. So I just want to just kind of connect of how these things are showing up not only in underwriting and investment structure and return profiles, but also how folks are thinking around reframing risk, but I'll let others go as well.
Yeah, I think there's so many great examples. The work that I do at Justice Funders is really, I have the privilege of just like having conversations with folks about the amazing work that they're doing across the country, which is always fun, learning about their integrated capital funds and being able to see that, one-on-one in terms of like how folks are really shifting, their work to be in challenge of what philanthropy typically will do with capital. I think, this might be a great place for, to mention our own fund at Justice Funders, the Just Transition Integrated Capital Fund, which really is completely shifting that dynamic. It serves as a learning tool really for philanthropy, right? So for philanthropy to practice something different, for them to have a demonstration of like what does it look like when you actually don't get to control the resources that you provide to a fund, right? The fund that we have is completely democratically governed and controlled by movement partners. And really Justice Funders has no, hand in how the resources are allocated, and so it's really an interesting tool that I think we're hoping, we start to, see more and more of across the field, where for as an example, the fund asks that the investors into the fund report to us, right? Usually, typically it's, folks that are receiving the investment have to report to the funder. And so flipping that on its head to say like, hey, actually, we want to know what you're learning through this investment. What are you learning about your own practices? What are you learning about, what's challenging you about, this approach? And yeah, that's why we call it like a learning tool, really. So philanthropy can really see that there's other ways to do this kind of work and to resource communities. And I think it's we hope that it's a model for the field, to really, take a look inward to say like, how does that 180, what does that 180 actually look like in practice? Another example with the fund is what's typically called like a conflict of interest, policy. The fund actually has Jamie's on the governing body. So I'm like, what's the name of it? Contract of interdependence, right? So really taking a more like a holistic and non-competitive, very collaborative, collective approach to how resources are allocated into communities, right? And I think to earlier points about like, the practices that we've adopted over time really just do not work for the kind of work that we're trying to do in communities. And so I think the JTIC Fund is a great example of, what does that look like for philanthropy to, be kind of to take a back seat, right? Where typically they're in the driver's seat when it comes to resourcing communities. And so it's really an exciting model that we're hoping, we can see, to shift that power and capital, Jamie. We're hoping to see more and more of that come into the field, and we are. There's so many funds that are now developing because it's kind of like a wildfire, I guess, right? Like you see in Boston or New Orleans or in the Bay Area different funds that are kind of bubbling up, and they're inspired by one another, right? And they're also inspired by this idea, this notion of really challenging philanthropy and its practices around extractive finance. And I think I'll leave it there, but there's so many really good examples. And just put a shameless plug for the JTIC Fund.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And it's been really helpful to think about how individual funds are operating differently, how individual organizations are acting differently in a way that can be very illuminating for the rest of the field. As I think beyond these individual decisions, I'm curious to hear from you all. What do you think are systemic or policy changes that would help restructure how risk is assessed and distributed in our economy?
I think a policy decision or a practice change that can inform how lenders and philanthropy and government do their work is racial equity assessment, either initiating it or routinizing it. This is something that at my agency, Maryland DHCD, I'm happy to say that we're engaging in for the first time. But racial equity assessment compels us to disaggregate our data by race, examine the benefits and burdens that our work creates for different groups, and to surface any practice changes that we can make based on our assessment to increase racial equity. Often this is something that's tried, but is a one-off, or if we get the grant, we do it. And I know that equitable evaluation tends to be the more popular parlance in philanthropy, but I'm really excited about what's incorporating a racial equity assessment into our work in the same way that like one might do a routine environmental impact assessment on a development project. Like I'm very excited about what that might mean. And we're starting to win over institutional actors in the housing finance space around the importance of racial equity assessment. So for instance, the Michigan Housing Finance Agency recently conducted a racial equity assessment of their qualified allocation plan. That is the document that state housing finance agencies use to allocate their competitive low-income housing tax credits. So they wanted to determine the extent to which the values and interests of residents of subsidized housing, as well as emerging developers of color, the extent to which their interests, their values, their needs are being served by how we expend millions of dollars annually in this public-private partnership. But then also in the wake of the 2020 racial reckoning, the Affordable Housing Investors Council, this is the industry group of large-scale financial institutions that purchase low-income housing tax credits. They conducted a racial equity assessment of their underwriting criteria because they wanted to understand whether their underwriting guidelines were preventing emerging developers of color from building wealth as project sponsors, from engaging in that for us, by us redevelopment of low-income areas. So I think the sort of deal review, really standardizing it, making it part of how we do our business, could change a lot of things. And I think once you start asking questions about who's benefiting, who's being burdened, you can begin to explore what comes next.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Kuru. When I think around this questions about systems change or different things, I think we're doing it in many different ways. As you shared earlier, Crystal, looking at our underwriting policies and practices. When I was previously at my previous organization, Native Women Lead, we introduced the 5 R's of rematriation, but really from an Indigenous woman's point of view. So that's also bringing our culture, our worldview into the 5 C's of credit, and really, I think, analyzing how the 5 C's of credit as a traditional underwriting framework that's used across the country in the US has actually been quite exclusionary and doesn't take into account the historical inequities and trauma that has been committed, so to speak. So that was one way in which, from a systems point of view, as that part of a system in underwriting, we looked at shifting the system. I think narrative shift is really important, right? And like that was the Nusenda project. Let's just prove that our communities are not risky. Here you go. Okay, CDFI now institutionalize it, and then from that level, we can also use a lot of demonstration and influence projects, right? And that's what I think we do at Common Future. Like, look, like these things are actually viable and they're sustainable, and they're actually ways that the communities are creating things in which could be replicated or adapted or scaled at larger institutions that are trying to reckon with how do we get more money into the hands of these communities. I think another really interesting model is to look at like how we're mobilizing capital. It's kind of hard to like move capital uphill, but when you have a system or an ecosystem of like networked folks that are living into their strengths and their gifts and filling the gaps of where they need support and resources, you can actually mobilize capital in a efficient way. And I think that's something that could happen with the impact investment side, because we're all super excited about funding these different projects, funds across the country that are doing this important work, that are folks that are right on the ground with community and representative of the community. But in like deal flow, we're trying to figure out, okay, great. Like, how do we decrease the burden, to your point, Krista, on like who's benefiting and who holds the burden? How do we decrease the burden on the communities for having to continue to ask for capital, which I've seen in philanthropy as well. But how do we organize as a capital allocator, as a wealth holder, as an intermediary to ensure that these projects and these community-led visions are properly resourced so that they can do the work that they're here to do? Because, like we have to mobilize in solidarity in order to like support these communities to accelerate. And I just want to acknowledge, like, we sit in a very contentious time, not only politically, economically, globally, that we're within a system where we're trying to, like, with finance, for example, we're trying to change and challenge it at the same time. And because finance is a system created by humans, we can change it. As I always think about my friend Joy at Criterion Institute, who reminds me of that often. Like, you can always change this system. We created it, and therefore we do have the power and the responsibility to change it.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jamie. All the fake rules. I lead with the mindset that most of this is made up. Like, so yeah, I think in terms of systems, I think one of the things that just to build on both Crystal and Jamie's points, I think there's a need to unlock a lot of capital that is trapped in the stock market. And a lot of that capital is held by, it's not all of it, right? There's a whole another sector of, like, of resources out there in the world. But I think within the philanthropic sector, I don't know, most people I think may know this, but 95% of the resources that philanthropic foundations have, family foundations, sometimes community foundations, 95% of those resources are held in the stock market. And there's a requirement to only give 5%, right, out into communities to do via their grant making. And so a lot of these foundations that have investments, they have endowments, not investments, endowments, they're, just kind of sitting there. And so I think part of our role at Justice Funders is to really challenge philanthropy and that approach, right? Of, why is it only 5%, of your endowment is going towards actual communities? And within that 95%, right? How much of the work that you're doing in communities is actually harming the work that you're investing into via the 5%? And so there's just like this reoccurring conversation over and over again within philanthropy of, like, as an example, you have a family foundation who was invested in the stock market, and a lot of their investments are in companies that are harmful to the planet, right? Like environmentally, there's no, we talk about ESG, but even that's not doing enough, right? I think there is a need to just, like, remove a lot of that capital from the stock market, because if in the same breath you are funding communities to, to do, work, in support of climate change, right? And then at the same time, 95% of your investments are literally in fossil fuels. Like, it starts to not make sense anymore. And so I think there's a need for us to really continue to do that organizing that Jamie's talking about, to organize philanthropy around these ideas of, like, this is an additional way, right, where we can really support communities and really invest in communities by not undoing the work that you're already trying to do via your grant making, and unlocking that capital. A lot of it is really just trapped in a really harmful, market. And so I think a lot of that organizing is super important as another way that we can really support communities to have the resources that they need.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm hearing a lot about how organizing is really essential, especially for holding these institutions accountable, because as you just pointed out, Kuru, the math ain't mathing if you're investing in one thing and investing against community at the same time. So I think that that's a really powerful example. With that, I want to also just incorporate some questions that we're hearing from the audience. And so thank you to everybody who's been raising questions throughout. I want to start with Janae's question. It starts with, your insights on redefining risk have been helpful to start imagining a different future for how CDFIs look at risk. Beyond focusing on financial returns, have you seen examples of investments that CDFIs or similar organizations are making across other types of capital, such as social or political capital? What strategies have been successful in supporting communities to thrive holistically rather than focusing solely on financial metrics? I know we might have touched on pieces of this throughout, but I would just love to hear if this brings up anything for you.
I would just say, other than what I shared with the New Sender Project, which is a CDFI credit union, as folks in the community trying to leverage those dollars, we were actually able to, like, leverage their assets to show as a partner. Like, we have a back office, and we do that with Common Future. We have a back office that supports community-led organizations and institutions to do their critical mission work while we support them on the finance side. But with social capital, I think continuing to fund like wraparound support services for like entrepreneurs, for example, when we work in the field of supporting social enterprises, that's really valuable. Like being able to support them to create these networks, to make introductions with funders or other investors, or to be able to, create spaces for them where they support them to create spaces where they can be in community with one another. I think that's a strong thing of how we contribute to adding to their social and cultural capital, and that folks feel safe and seen and heard and understood from like the shared experience of the shared lived and collective learned and labored experience. I think that's one way we can contribute in a way that's not just financial, but supporting social capital of these communities that we work with. And then I think the political capital as well, what Justice Funders has done with specifically supporting movement builders, as well as organizing philanthropy. That's a really interesting thing, right? Because you're bringing a specific sector of philanthropy and then movement organizers that are really doing movement work and trying to transcend like systems. Like, it's really interesting to see like those two bodies work together, because I do think that's like political activation and movement support as well.
I think the potential to build social capital of movement groups and neighborhood-based organizations lies in what Kuru has been mentioning around governance, ensuring that these orgs have a seat at the table when decisions are being made. And I think that's how you translate the values of this emergent strategy around collective land stewardship into like a public sector paradigm, empowering folks with decision-making authority. In Baltimore, community land trusts are funded by the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which they had a hand in creating back in 2018 when they launched a grassroots movement known as the Fair Development Roundtable. It was all about racial, economic, and environmental justice, wanting to see fair development in the city as opposed to the sort of extracted development that builds new higher income neighborhoods that ultimately displace and dispossess low-income people who have an entrenched interest in their neighborhoods, who have been legacy homeowners and residents in neighborhoods that until recently, folks really didn't want to live in them. So our CLTs are funded by this Affordable Housing Trust Fund that they demand be created, but they also had a hand in setting up the governance strategy for the fund. So the fund has commissioners, and the commissioners in the Baltimore City Charter, thanks to the CLTs, include folks who have an experience of homelessness, include folks who are currently a low-income renter, include a fair housing expert. So you have designated seats at the table to ensure that the communities that are using the fund to build housing, permanently affordable housing, removing land and housing from the speculative market, you have seats at the table that allow them to make decisions about the overall operations of the fund, the governance of the fund. I think that's how we can build social capital. And I think another way, in terms of government, and this is something that extends beyond the state housing finance agency role into the grant-making role. Under this new administration with Governor Wes Moore, we have the privilege of taking on certain national best practices, these sort of promising approaches that other progressive states have done to invest in low-income people, but these are, quote, big bets. So there is a reputational risk there inherent in who gets the grant for the best practice, which neighborhood groups or which like cross-sector leadership table do you trust to take on this really technical, expensive, new challenge. And I think the way that we build social capital is by granting to those underdogs, is by going to the groups in the most disinvested areas, the groups who don't have that long-standing development track record, the groups who other funders are waiting to see whether or not they can make it another year. I think the way that we build their social capital is by placing our big bets on them, as opposed to returning to the same national nonprofits that will continue to do their work, irrespective of whether or not they get a grant from the state. So.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly powerful example of what social capital looks like in practice, what it means to really trust community and put your money behind that in a way that allows them to increase the influence that they should definitely have. They're the ones who are closest to this work. So I really appreciate that example. I want to turn to another question. That we have from Brian. I'm curious if any one of you have experience with this. So he asked, how might a public bank create policy and loan development programs to support local CDFIs to empower and invest capital in our Black and Brown communities?
I would say with community first and foremost, that's a big thing, that you have to design these policies, processes, practices with community at the onset. And I really loved your example, Crystal, around like the types of folks that are, involved in the governance decision making, because those are the folks with lived experience that are actually experiencing the onslaught or the impact daily. And absolutely deserving of a seat at the table, but also like we're going to build our own tables if this doesn't happen. And that's what we're seeing with all these emerging funds, right? Is just to really think about like, why are these funds being created? It's because traditional finance is not provided access to our communities, and we've essentially then taken a driver's, I guess, seat to like just build and dream something different. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to anybody else who wants to answer.
Yeah, I was gonna answer the same way as Jamie. It's really community first and making sure that yeah, it's driven and led by the folks that are you're hoping to have an impact on. Again, as Jamie stated, the folks closest to the issue have the solutions. And I think, yeah, particularly naming those intentions and those uh like calling that, naming that, outwardly, I think in policy, I think is really important for any institution that is trying to support communities. As we all know, a lot of the policies are also made up. And so having that intentionality and that guiding North Star that states that this is the purpose and this is how we are going to be accountable to community, I think is super important, particularly in policy.
I also want to just note on another thing of like risk and return when we think of defaults. This just came up, but even a default is like a community return, right? Like that money went to community. So like, how do we just try to like normalize like and feel okay with that? Like we might have lost our institutional money, but like that actually went to the impact or the purpose we wanted to drive that towards. So I think there's a lot of like flexibility and wiggle room we need to build within our institutions to be okay with that. And even getting into that reparative and like restorative stance, like actually our goal was repair and to restore. And yeah, any of the work that we intentionally do with community, despite financials and whatnot, like we're still doing repair work. So I just want to just uplift that as well, as we're trying to like reimagine and build new tables and ensure that folks have seats at the table as well.
Thank you so much for that, Jamie. And I think that that's a perfect lead in just to the conclusion of this conversation, which has been really powerful and uplifted so many wonderful ideas. I'd love to hear from each of you, and Jamie, you might have just provided it, but what would you like to see normalized as a result of a reframing of risk and return? How would you want narratives or goals in your communities to look different?
I don't want Indigenous people to be so invisible in the world. We're stewarding 80% of the world's biodiversity. We are deserving of a seat at the table, and we will build our own tables. So I'd like to see, yeah, I guess Indigenous people more normalized in the conversation and included in the conversations, even if we throw these terms around BIPOC around, but just really like that deep commitment to ensuring there's voice and yeah, representation. And in light of the world right now, how it exists, I do want to have I want to see like healing normalize. I know that might sound funny for folks in finance, but there's a lot of research around how systemic, economic, intergenerational, relational, economic trauma, like those different layers of trauma actually affect financial behaviors, but they also affect financial behaviors with wealth holders and hoarders. And I think there's a need to really look at the psychology of money and power and really, yeah, take a step back and reassess ourselves.
Yeah, I think for me, I think I would love to just have these kinds of conversations be a lot more normal in general. Just like spaces like this where we can kind of dissect and like really see how, folks are operationalizing different ways of being across the country. And just being in deeper conversation about some of the things that I may or may not be part of our normal day-to-day kind of like speak when we're talking about things like risk and return. You kind of just throw out those words casually sometimes. And then there's probably so many, like as Jamie was talking, I was thinking about the word default, right? Like even that's a scary term, I think, and there's just like this like connotation and like this like, yeah, this weird feeling that you get from even saying the word default. And I think, yeah, just like being able to dissect our relationship with money and finance. And I think particularly for philanthropy to have this as more of a practice for themselves of like really digging deep into how it's history and how it's tied to banking and how it's tied to systems of oppression and how their wealth has accumulated through stolen land, wealth, labor. And so I think having these spaces where we're, just dissecting these conversations and going deeper into like, what is this now? What does it look like, right? And the work that what we see today within government, within philanthropy, and, how, folks are accessing capital, like those kinds of things. I think having just spaces like this is really important. And I think particularly for folks who are newer to these conversations, newer to these concepts, for particularly folks entering into right a finance world or like or even folks that are entering into movement spaces. And so, yeah, I think it's just super important for these conversations to be lifted up more regularly as a practice. And I think I would love to see that be normal. Yeah, just a normal part of our work. So.
And the only thing I'll add is just to like reiterate some things I shared throughout the call: decoupling race and risk, redefining risk and service of mission, pivoting from credit worthiness to credit readiness. And I too was inspired by Jamie's thoughts on default, and they reminded me of an Adrienne Marie Brown quote. She said that there are no mistakes, just data. So I hope that this sort of spirit of experimentation, of shared learning, curiosity, willingness to be curious about what it might mean to pursue racial equity and social justice as a matter of course within our field. I wonder what that might look like. I think that spirit of experimentation and curiosity would be really healthy. And I think that would lead us on a course towards the liberatory future that we all want and deserve.
Thank you so much for sharing these thoughts. And Kuru, to your point, these conversations are really important. This is just one part of the Redefining Risk series where we hope to unpack these very ideas. So thank you all so much for joining today. And I really hope that through this conversation, it was able to illuminate what it would look like to center community and also illustrate just different examples of how this is actually happening. But again, as Kuru said, this conversation needs to be continued. So thank you again, and we hope to see you at the next session.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Please stay in
Bye.
connection. Thank you.